Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you to our new segment for the health of it, a virtual moment on health education. Today, we want to welcome Dr. Laverne Bruce, and we're going to have a brief information moment on food safety. So, Dr. Bruce, welcome. It's so good to have you today. We're so glad that you're with us to share this very vital information. And I think to start out, I just want to ask you, what do we need to know about food and plastic?
Well, Pastor Kinlock, thank you so very much for giving me this opportunity to discuss this very, very important and extremely relevant topic. This came to my attention because there are several very, very important studies which came out in the last several weeks that have a lot to do with food and plastics. Now, first of all, let's give a quick overview. Plastics actually have been with us only about 100 years. They were actually invented in the 1860s as a substitute for shellac, but didn't get a lot of traction. Several people improved on it. Plastics are really a combination of formaldehyde and phenol. When the two substances are combined under high heat and high pressure, you get this amazing material. Now, plastics have made life so much better for everyone because they have replaced our dependence on natural materials. Now, after World War II, plastics really took off. So instead of putting glass in a plate, you could put glass. Instead of having to spend lots of money on real glass, people could now buy plastic cups. And so within the last 120 years or so, plastics have really become ubiquitous and literally taken over our lives. Now, in the 1960s, people began to be very concerned about the effect of just the physical plastics on the planet. Lots and lots of plastics in the oceans and animals, etc. But then in the 1980s or so, people began to realize there was an even more serious problem. And that is that in order to make plastics pliable or to get them into the shape and structure that you want, manufacturers add specific chemicals called phthalates and bisphenol A. And those chemicals have started to leach into the substances that are in those packets. So a big concern starting in the 80s was the fact that these chemicals were now leaching into the food that we eat, which is wrapped in plastic or comes in plastic. Now, so in the early 2000s, there was a very important study that came out of Johns Hopkins University, and it was panned widely, and many people didn't pay any attention to it. But that professor showed that when you microwave food wrapped in plastic, there are actually bits of plastic that end up in the food. And people began to study the blood of Americans and began to find that Americans actually carry around the highest level of plastic in their blood in the world. Now, the three most important studies that came out recently, that is as in 2022, we know, for example, that plastics mimic estrogens. So that when they mimic an estrogen, they can either make the estrogen effect stronger or they can block the receptor, making the estrogen effect weaker. They also inhibit testosterones. High levels of BPA and phthalates also decrease our immune function, decrease our ability to function with our thyroid. And some scientists are bold enough to say that they believe that these substances actually are causing infertility in the world and are also related to testicular cancers because there is so much reproductive interruption or disruption because of these chemicals. Now, to be the FDA came out recently after doing a study for about 8 years and said, well, BPA and phthalates are safe for the purposes that they were intended. But now we're beginning to find that it's not just the chemicals. There was a recent study done looking at food wrappers from various very, very popular restaurants. I'm not going to name them because I don't want anybody to go after me, but anybody can go on Google and Google this. There are about 10 restaurants that were studied, and it found that the chemicals used in the wrappers, which are used to prevent oil and water from soaking the wrapper, they have leached into the food, and there were measurable levels of them. The second part of the issue with plastics is not only the chemicals that leach into the food, but the second issue is that now we are finding microscopic bits of plastic in the human body. And this is the most recent study that we've been looking at. Number one, they found bits of microscopic plastic called microplastics in the blood and found that they're traveling throughout the body and can actually block organs. Then there was a study when they looked at segments of lung removed from people who were having lung surgery and found that there were microscopic bits of plastics found deep in the lungs. And the most disturbing one of these studies was they looked at the feces of babies in a study in the Netherlands and found significant bits of microplastics at a level far superior to what you find in adults.
So Dr. Bruce, this is really concerning information. This is great information that you're sharing, but pretty much plastic is all around us now. And what you're saying is based off of the way that it's being packaged, that it's actually in us.
Because a lot of food gets heated, and these chemicals, whenever food has oil especially, these chemicals come into the oil. And so even babies, for example, their bottles are plastic, their sippy cups are plastic, their straws may be plastic, their clothes may have plasticizers in them to make them more synthetic, more flexible. And so in the feces of babies, they found significant amounts of microscopic bits of plastic.
Wow.
Facing a significant concern.
Okay. So Dr. Bruce, then what can we do to protect ourselves from these hazards?
It's a very, very broad question that we really cannot answer in just a few minutes because plastics are everywhere. If you were to check your day from the moment you wake up and you touch your plastic alarm clock, or you go to your car and the car is hot and some of those chemicals are coming up from the plastic seats, plastics have invaded our lives completely. But in order to be careful, we must learn to refuse plastic. So as much as possible, do not microwave at all in plastic. That is one of the most dangerous activities. Try not to store your food in plastic containers. This is so very common, but try to get to more porcelain, steel, stainless steel, or glass containers for storage of food in the refrigerators. Do not reheat your food in plastics or using plastic utensils. If you can, try not to use plastic plates, plastic knives, plastic forks. And of course, look at our clothing. A lot of our clothing has plastic, and we need to think about that. A lot of the things in our environment or maybe equipment that we use have plastic. So I think it calls for refusing it if we can, reducing the amount of it if we can't, and putting it out for recycling if we can. It's better to long-term plastics rather than short-term plastics. Those tend to be reusable. The disposable plastics tend to have more of these chemicals that are leaching into the food than plastics that are made very firm and meant to last a long time.
Wow. Thank you so very much, Dr. Bruce, with very critical information. That was just necessary. I learned so much, and I know those of you who are listening right now, you understand now that there is danger in the environment, danger with regard to food and plastics. And Dr. Bruce, thank you so much for giving us some tips of how we can kind of reduce some of those dangers so that we don't have a bunch of plastic on the inside of us. Well, that's another version. That's another segment of our For the Health of It. We want to thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for our upcoming segments. Take care.